Hi everyone, can everyone hear me? It's all well? Fantastic. So my name is Profscam, and I am the current chair of the Student Advisory Board for the Center for Politics and the People here at Ripon College. And it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Charlie Sykes. As a Republican, Sykes is known for his opposition to President Trump. He is founder and editor-at-large of Bulwark, host of the Bulwark Podcast, and an MSNBC contributor. From 1993 to 2016, Sykes has hosted a conservative talk show on WTMJ in Milwaukee, and he has written multiple books, with his most recent being How the Right Lost Its Mind. So, once again, welcome Mr. Charlie Sykes.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. This is the third time that I've come here. I think, when was it, about 10 years ago?
10 years.
About 3 years ago. So the various permutations of my career are played out here at Ripon. And one of the things that I've learned about being on cable TV a lot is the one thing you can't really ever say is, I don't know, because that's the point, right? You're on live television, you have to say, you have to come up with an opinion, you have to come up with an answer, but since we are all Wisconsinites and we are all here, I'm going to admit to you there are a lot of things that I do not know and I do not understand, and so I hope you'll forgive me if you ask me a question and I will give you the honest answer, as honest as I can, and it might be, I really have no idea. Because over the last several years, that's one of the things that I've found out, is things that I thought I knew that I was completely wrong about. And I'm still trying to figure it out. If you would have asked me 10 years ago when I was here, I would have told you that I understood exactly what conservatism was, what the conservative movement was, and where the Republican Party was likely heading. Obviously, I didn't understand it as well as I thought that I did. Now, two questions that people ask me most frequently are, number one, do you still live in Wisconsin? And the answer is yes. I still live in the Milwaukee area. Number two, are you still a conservative? Do you consider yourself a conservative? And my answer to that is, I do not consider myself a Republican, but I do consider myself a conservative. But I'm not sure what it means to be a conservative anymore. I'm not sure what those words mean and how they've changed. Because one of the things I've seen is that the definitions have changed so radically and continue to change. And so I actually find myself, and I have changed my mind on a variety of things, or more likely, I think more accurately, I think I'm more liberated and more willing to consider alternative points of view, because the one thing we've learned about politics is that politics, I think this was my fundamental mistake in politics, that I thought that politics was about ideas and about principles and about policies, when in fact it turns out that politics is more about attitude and tribal loyalty. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit more. I don't intend to speak very long because I really want to get to the question and answer period as quickly as possible. But in terms of the tribalism, what it means is that when you sign up for a tribe, you have to buy everything that the tribe is selling. And if the tribe is selling you something that is diametrically opposed to what it was selling you a year before, you needed to go along with that. Otherwise, you would be considered a traitor and you would be excommunicated. And so I think that even though I consider myself a conservative, I consider myself a contrarian conservative, which means that I still want to be open-minded. I still have basic principles about government, the relationship of the individual and government, and personal freedom, and fiscal conservatism, and free markets, and all the other things that seem so last century to the current Republican Party. So that's the one question that I have, and I think that at some point, with all of my friends at MSNBC, we'll come to that point where you go, well, you've been critical of Trump, but you're really still a conservative. And yes, and that will be an awkward moment. But what's been fascinating to me has been to watch the transformation of the conservative movement and to watch how it parallels the transformation of our politics. And I know that we're going to talk about that, where we're going, what's happening, what's the trajectory. And I think the last time that I was here, I talked about my real concern about the fate of truth in in our political dialogue? Do facts still matter? Have we entered a post-truth era? And I'm not sure whether at the time I quoted Gary Kasparov, because I don't think I met him at that time. I had a chance to meet him when I went to New York and hosted a public radio show of all things. Now, I actually went from doing a conservative radio talk show in Milwaukee, and then the next month I was doing public radio in New York. So I'm imagine how strange that was. That was being a stranger in a strange land. But one of the things I had a chance to do was to meet Gary Kasparov, who's the former world chess champion. Have you ever heard of him? Russian dissident who had been beaten and arrested by Vladimir Putin, and really has this deep understanding of what we are going through because he's seen that democracies can die. And one of the points that he made that really struck me was that all the lies, all of the propaganda that flood the political stage, and he saw this in Russia, that the point of the line was not to convince you to support one policy or another policy. It was not to advance, make you think one thing or another thing. The point of all of the flood of lies was to make you doubt your ability to discern the difference between truth and lies. The aim was to make you shrug and say, what is truth? It was the goal was the annihilation of truth. And I was concerned about that the last time I was here. I am far more concerned about it now, because all the trajectory that we're seeing in the media and in politics, I think, all of the things that I think that we saw in play in 2016 and afterwards, all of them are still in play, and they're all getting worse. And so I think that at some point we're going to get through this, we're going to get past this, because there's no alternative. We get through everything one way or another. But I'm not sure that we're ever going to be able to snap back to the way we were before. And the question is, how much damage are we going to sustain, and what values can we hold on to? And I think that the one thing that I've learned over the last several years is that obviously a lot of the conservatives that I thought that I knew had a different value system than I suspected. Many of the things that we were advocating for might have played differently than we had intended. But also, on a larger scale, that America is not immune to history. That many of our values and our institutions and our traditions are much more fragile than we thought they were. And I think that that's kind of the challenge we're at right now, is that we all thought that we had this really stable constitutional system, when in fact, the founders, who I think did a brilliant job, also created something of an honor system, with the assumption that the powers of the presidency would be held by people who were honorable, and that the voters would hold them to a certain standard of rectitude. What happens if that honor system breaks down? Well, stay tuned, because we're all about to find out together. So again, I'd like to open it up for questions, and I know that you have some questions prepared. And if there's anything that we don't address, feel free, because nothing's off the record and nothing's out of bounds. My only caveat is that if I don't know the answer, I will tell you I don't know.
Okay, fantastic. So the Student Advisory Board has prepared several questions. First of all, right after that, what was the straw that broke the camel's back for you with Trump? Like what?
It was the moment he came down the golden escalator. I was never Trump from the moment, and actually that's really not true. I was anti-Trump before he came down the golden escalator. In fact, I remember back in 2012, when I was doing my radio show, that we were getting a lot of emails when there was speculation that Donald Trump would run for president. I actually did a segment on the program which we call the "You Can't Be Serious" segment. That really you understand, who this man is. That he's a con man and a fraud and somebody lacking in basic principles, and certainly by no means a principled conservative. So I was talking about him in 2012, but there was no one moment. I have a lot of friends who can point to some incident, for example, when he mocked John McCain, said, I like POWs who were not captured, that was the turning point, but I never had a turning point.
what do you wish other people, other conservatives would see about Trump that may change their mind about supporting him?
Well, I was thinking about this when I was driving up today, and thinking particularly about conservatives in Wisconsin who did understand who Donald Trump was. I mean, people remember the history here, that we were outliers, that Wisconsin Republicans were not buying what he was selling, and while he was winning all over the rest of the country, he lost the Wisconsin primary by double digits. And you think back to 2016, and I would say that virtually every single conservative elected official in the country, as well as most conservative thought leaders, understood exactly who Donald Trump was and what the implications of his election were, although they didn't think it would actually happen. So they understood it. So it's not that they need to understand something about Donald Trump, it's that they need to understand something about themselves. So, and I've said this before, and I hope I'm not misunderstood, that my real objection is not to Trump because he is what he is. Well, I object to him. But, you know, Donald Trump is who we thought he was. What has been remarkable is the way that he has changed us. That other Republicans have decided that they watched him, they understood who he was, that he is this erratic, narcissistic individual with the emotional maturity and vocabulary of a 9-year-old, a schoolhouse bully, somebody with a long tradition of being a pathological liar and a con man. And they understood this. And yet, as he becomes president, he doesn't change, they change. They acquiesce. They acquiesce because it's either transactionalism, which is I get something in return for this. Some of them are afraid of his tweets. There's a very, very small number of people who actually drink the Kool-Aid and think that he is the Orange God King. But I guess what was most disappointing was watching them adjust their standards to him as opposed to hold him accountable. Because in 2016, I know a lot of Republicans that voted for Donald Trump, but they said, okay, I'm going to vote for Donald Trump because it's a binary choice, it's either him or Hillary, and I'm going to hold my nose, but we will hold him accountable when he's wrong, and we'll go along with him when he's right. So if he gives us conservative judges, we're going to be happy, but we will not let him get away with violating the norms of our politics. And then just to watch is one by one, they decided that that's exactly what they're going to do. So what I would really like conservatives to do is think of the damage they're doing to themselves and to their movement, the way in which they want to be remembered. One of the things that just amazes me watching elected officials, well, two things have amazed me. Well, actually, many things have amazed me, right? But especially members of Congress, that, first of all, don't you have more pride in your role as members of a co-equal branch of government? You don't work for the president. There's a long and proud tradition of Congress standing on its own prerogatives. The founding fathers assumed that members of the United States Senate would stand against an overweening executive. So that's number one, why they think of themselves as potted plants rather than as people of a very considerable power. They are not powerless. That's number one. Number two, and this goes really to the heart of your question, is I would really want them to think about how do you think history is going to remember you? You would think that at a certain age you would start thinking about that legacy. I'm kind of amazed. I still can't quite get my head around Bill Barr, the Attorney General, when he's asked about, are you concerned about your legacy? And his answer was something like, well, I'm going to be dead soon, so I don't need to worry about that. Isn't that the moment when you start worrying about that? I mean, really? I mean, if you're thinking, I'm going to be dead soon, don't you start thinking about how am I going to be remembered? What do I say? I've got nothing to lose. So I guess I would ask conservatives, remember who you are, what you used to believe. That you used to believe that character mattered. You used to believe in fiscal conservatism. You used to believe in free markets. You used to believe in the rule of law. You used to believe that America was exceptional. And you used to believe that the President of the United States should not kowtow and suck up to authoritarian thugs like Vladimir Putin or Turkish President Erdogan. So remember who you are and what you actually believe, as opposed to being part of this cult of personality. Long answer to that.
No, fantastic. So now to open up this can of worms, impeachment hearings have started. What are some thoughts initially?
Well, it's only day one of the impeachment hearings. I do write for a publication called Bulwark.com. I'll give a quick plug to that. And I was up at 5 this morning writing a piece called 10 Takeaways from Day One. You know, it is going to be interesting to see. This is only the third time in modern history that we've had the impeachment hearings of the President of the United States. It's the first time in the current modern media environment. There's really no suspense here because we know what the story is. We know what the President did. So the question is, what are our standards? So once again, this is not like Watergate where you're waiting on the smoking gun, or Clinton where you're waiting on the blue dress. We know what actually happened. The question is whether we care, whether or not there is any standard that we're going to hold the President. I think that I wish that Republicans were being more open-minded about this, because I think there are fundamental principles of the abuse of power at stake here, about truth, as well as whether or not the President is above the law. I mean, literally, this is one of the constitutional moments that bothers me the most, that the position of the Department of Justice is that the President cannot be charged with a crime while he's President. President Trump's lawyers have argued in court that the President has absolute immunity. And they were actually asked by a federal judge, she was saying that if the President actually did shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue, that he could not be arrested or investigated. And the lawyers said yes. But they're also arguing that there's something improper about Congress exercising its constitutional responsibility of impeachment. The process of impeachment is in the Constitution. It's in the Constitution for a reason. But if you take what they're saying at face value, it means that we have a system of government in which we have invested so much power, not absolute, but so much power in the President, who then literally becomes above the law, which is one of those moments where you thought, now wait, we thought that was the whole point of our system, that you cannot be above the law. So we're going to see how this plays out. I'm fascinated. I think that yesterday was not a good day for the President. I think it is extraordinary, the number of people who are coming forward and offering testimony. I think that testimony is going to continue. Unfortunately, in a post-truth environment, we have these two alternative competing realities that if you are on the left, you hear one version of events. If you're on the right, you're hearing a very, very different version of events. And this adds to my concern about being in a post-truth environment. How does a democracy function if there's no agreement about what the facts are? I mean, we talk about democracy rather flippantly sometimes, but if there's no understanding of that we don't live in the same factual universe or the same moral universe, then what is there to talk about? How do we have debates? How does a democratic process actually work?
May I follow up?
Yes, of course.
Charlie, the President said under Article 2 he's all-powerful. But you commented, and we've heard it, that the President cannot be charged with a crime. Now that's not in the Constitution. Where did that notion come from, and why are people pushing back?
They ought to be pushing back on it. It's a very, very good question. First of all, when the President says under Article 2 I can do anything, which is ridiculous and shows his constitutional ignorance, which again I find extraordinary. And I'm going to get to your question. If you talk to my fellow conservatives, one of the things they will tell you that they value the most is our pro-Constitution judges. They're willing to put up with everything. They're willing to put up with the payoffs to porn stars. They're willing to put up with anything as long as they get conservative judges. Why conservative judges? Because conservative judges respect and will uphold the Constitution. And then you have a president who says the Constitution gives me absolute power, which shows either his fundamental ignorance or contempt for the Constitution. And I have to tell you that I do think this relates to his absolute fascination with other autocrats around the world who have the same attitude towards the democratic process. But that's a digression. the point you're making is this notion from the Department of Justice that the president cannot be charged with a crime while he is serving, and that was something cited in the Mueller report for why they did not go ahead. I think it's very clear reading the Mueller report that Bob Mueller would have charged any other American with obstruction of justice had they been able to do that. I mean, that's pretty clear. The standard that the president cannot be charged does not exist in the Constitution, as you point out. Does not exist in any statutory authority. Congress never passed that. It is an internal memorandum in the Department of Justice that is just a memorandum, which means that it can change. And some of the presidential candidates have suggested that they would review that and change that in the future. But you're right, there ought to be a pushback, because if there's one principle that we really ought to all agree on, is that no one's above the law. I mean, is that a right-wing or a left-wing position? Is that a Democrat or a Republican position, that no one is above the law? I mean, Richard Nixon may have tried it, but our political legal system was so much healthier in the 1970s that we sort of spit it out. It was like, absolutely not. You know, Mr. Nixon, you are not above the law. You are not immune from all of these things. And the question is whether we've progressed or regressed since the 70s.
So I guess in this era, how does Trump perceive his view in the party, and do you think there's a chance of him resigning?
No, Trump is not resigning. Trump's not going anywhere.
I guess who do you think might be an ideal alternative candidate as a more traditional conservative?
Well, I am used to disappointment on this. This is one of the things that during 2016, I promiscuously went from one candidate to another looking for an alternative. You know, I started off supporting Marco Rubio. By the time Wisconsin rolled around, and you got to bear with me on this. By the time Wisconsin rolled around, you might remember I was backing Ted Cruz, who was not a great fit for Wisconsin. But Wisconsin voters were so savvy; they understood that even somebody like Cruz was strategically necessary to try to block Donald Trump. So, in terms of ideal, I've kind of given up on ideal, because I kind of know that I'm not getting a unicorn for Christmas, and I'm not getting someone who is ideal. I'm embarrassed to say that if you would have asked me that 9 months ago at a forum like this, I might have said Nikki Haley. But this disease that seems to be spreading throughout the Republican Party, which is that the coin of the realm is absolute and total loyalty, has just swept through conservative ranks. So I'm not sure. There are two candidates who are running against Donald Trump in the primaries. Neither one of them is ideal. Joe Walsh is running, who I think is kind of a little bit too Trumpy for my taste, and I've written about that. Bill Weld, the former governor of Massachusetts, who has a mixed record, but would be a substantial improvement, and he has no chance whatsoever of winning.
How can you create an environment where flexibility in political views is allowed, and is there a way to not agree without becoming isolated within your party?
That's actually a harder question than you think it is, because as I mentioned before, what I kind of like in my exile, because I am excommunicated from the Republican. I have no illusions about that at all whatsoever, cast out. But I like the fact that I can be more flexible in my views. I think that most of you, most normal, regular human beings like to be able to make up your mind. The problem is that our politics forces us into these boxes. And the pressure of uniformity is that if you believe, A, B, and C, you must believe D, even if D makes no sense to you whatsoever. And you can make the smorgasbord of, how do you feel about gay rights, the flat tax, gun control, health care? Well, you can imagine that most reasonable people might have differing views on all of that. But the pressures of tribalism And I know that's an overused word, but I think that's what's driving our politics, is that you have to believe all of those things, otherwise you're cast out. Unless, of course, well, we can get to some of the people who change their minds on a variety of things. So I also want to point out just one thing that always strikes me, and one reason why I like coming to events like this is I spend way too much time on Twitter, way too much time on social media, and in the various bubbles. You know, yeah, if you spend time on cable television, on Twitter, the world looks very different. People are much more shrill, they are much more judgmental, they are ruder, they are crueler. So when you step out into the real world outside of Twitter, it's always a little bit of a shock to realize that people are actually kind of nice and reasonable and thoughtful, and you can have a conversation that is above 280 characters that can be fruitful. So I think this is one thing to remind yourselves, is that I think most Americans are fundamentally decent, and I think that they are honorable. And unfortunately, we have outsourced our political dialogue to these loud voices, you know, at the end of the bar, the loud voices on the extreme, and those don't necessarily represent who we are, or God willing, they don't represent who we are.
I guess on top of that, I mean, what are your thoughts or fears on people kind of entering these echo chambers through, you know, Twitter and cable news and things like that? I'm
very afraid of it, and in fact, I think that sorting out has accelerated, and I think it will be worse a few years from now than it is now. It's gone from being echo chambers to being alternative reality silos, and I've told the story. I've told it in articles, but also in my book, of my experience in 2015 and 2016. Look, I was part of this process, and I fully understand this. You know, being in conservative talk radio for 20 years. But when I started in the early 1990s, we were a relatively small voice in the media ecosystem. And we saw ourselves as people who would tell the other side of the story, because the assumption was that people would get their news from the legacy news media, the mainstream media, whatever, however you wanted to describe it. So that we were a kind of a counter voice, never something intended to totally replace it. Now, you might remember that when Ronald Reagan was president, there was no Fox News. There was no talk radio, really, conservative talk radio. That didn't happen until after the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine in the late 1980s. So that there was no internet, there was no Breitbart.com, there was no Drudge Report. None of this actually existed during what many of us think about as the high point of American conservatism under Ronald Reagan. So throughout the 1990s, you began to have a conservative media world growing. And I think in part in reaction to, yes, media bias, which is real. It is not an illusion that the media has a certain point of view. And I lived with that for many, many, many years. And I've sort of seen both sides of it. I will tell you this story, that, that the difference between 8:30 on the morning of March 28th, 2016, and 8:45. See, at 8:30 in the morning on March 28th, 2016, before Donald Trump called into my radio show, I was a right-wing radio hack, okay, who had not been interviewed by the local Wisconsin media for almost 20 years, interested in what I actually had to say. 17 minutes later, I was one of the deepest, most profound thinkers in America. And I've since written for the New York Times, and for NBC, and for The Atlantic. Now, what changed? Well, I understand this. I'm under no illusions. What happened? So I understand media bias. But your question was about these bubbles. So in 2015 and 2016, as this all heated up, I started getting a lot of these stories that the fake news stories. This is the stuff from the bots. The stories about, they're just made up stories. And as I had done for years, I would send them back to the people who sent them and said, this is not true. Here's the actual fact. You probably don't want to be forwarding this. And 9 times out of 10, the response I would get would be, hey, thank you. I shouldn't have forwarded Uncle Emo's email. I won't do that anymore. I'm sorry. Maybe I won't go to risingeagleliberty.com for my information about Hillary Clinton. But as the year went on, it became harder and harder to push back on the propaganda, on the BS. Until about middle of 2016, I had people that I had known for 20 years. When you're on the radio, you have a relationship with people over a long period of time. These people I'd really known well. And I knew were really good, decent people. And they would send me just the most awful stuff. I mean, from these racist websites, from probably Russian bot websites. And I would send them stuff back saying, okay, this is completely nonsense. And here's some background on this that you might find interesting. And by 2016, what I was getting from people was like, well, that's from the New York Times, or that's the Washington Post, or that's NBC, or that's NPR. These are all liberal rags. I don't believe it. And then it started dawning on me, like, oh my God, we have gone so far that we've delegitimized all fact-based journalism, that if it was outside of the bubble, that they weren't going to listen to it, and that we were creating these alternative reality silos. And that's when I really, it was kind of a shock at the time to realize that what had begun as a critique of media bias had become the destruction of media credibility, which meant that the immune system on the right, among my fellow conservatives, the immunity to propaganda and to BS had been destroyed. And that was just the beginning. Now it's accelerating, so I am deeply concerned about this, that we are going to become two nations, that we already have become two countries, and it's going to play out in very consequential ways.
So we just have a couple more questions from the board, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So first, we're on a college campus. What role do college students have in this? What trends are you seeing among young people or even young conservatives?
Well, I did speak to young conservatives about a month ago at the University of Wisconsin, the College Republicans. I'm not sure why they invited me, considering where I'm at on all of this. And one of the things that I tried to tell them at the time was, look, you may keep open the possibility that your political views will be very different 10, 15, 20 years ago than they are right now, that the people who disagree with you are not completely evil, that during the college years, do not fall into the trap of absolute tribalism, because that requires you to stop thinking, stop exercising independent thought, and as long as you possibly can, stay engaged with the ideas, and also remember that if you want to be involved in politics, put not your faith in princes. That if you get into politics because you are serving the ambition of a single individual, you're going to end up disappointed, and you'll waste an awful lot of time. So hopefully, people will take this to heart. I was very, very involved in politics when I was in both in high school and in college. In fact, there's a couple people, because I can't pretend I because I have witnesses, people who were actually, and when I was in college, believe it or not, I was in the Young Democrats, very active in Young Democrats, became much more conservative when I was in college, and came out very different. So when I entered college, I was a liberal Democrat. By the time I exited, I think I was more liberal skeptical, a recovering liberal, and became much more conservative. So people think I've made the full circuit. I haven't, but I learned to respect people of different views. And I think this is one of the, unfortunately, a problem on both the right and the left, the desire to play the victim card, the desire to shut down ideas that you don't like. There are actual snowflakes on campus, and they can be extremely intolerant. One of the things that I spent many years writing about before this current era happened was the climate on campuses, on college and university campuses. And I found it highly ironic that institutions devoted to the life of the mind, that there was so much intolerance for ideas that were deemed to be heretical. So I would fight against that as much as possible.
And finally, just how long do you think it'll be before there is a shift in the party, or it swings back, or will there be one?
In the Republican Party?
Yes.
I don't know. I really don't know. And I don't think that anybody else knows. I think that a lot of people are just sort of keeping their heads down, waiting for the fever to break. I think that there have been very, very prominent Wisconsinites who have played major roles in the Republican Party, who are simply hoping that somehow we can go back to some sort of normalcy. I think they underestimate the amount of long-term damage they've done with the Republican Party. And my concern about American politics is the same. I would like to believe that we're a pendulum, and that things swing back and forth, that when you go to one extreme, you swing back to the other extreme. I would like to think that's true, and maybe that will happen. The other model that I'm most fearful of is think of it as a ratchet, that every time we destroy a norm, every time we break down the standards or accept things that were previously unacceptable, that it's harder to go back. And so things happened during the 90s that led to where we're at right now. I think that you could certainly argue that you would not have had Donald Trump if you had not had Bill Clinton. So 30 years from now, what is the fallout from Trump going to be? But I do think the damage of the Republican Party is going to be very, very long-lasting. You asked about impeachment. I think one of the key moments to save the Republican Party was 1974, when Republicans decided they weren't going to go down with Richard Nixon. I want you to think about this, those of you who remember this. When Barry Goldwater and others, Jim Buckley, who was William F. Buckley's brother, who's in the United States Senate, they went to President Nixon and said, we're out. We're not going to go along with your obstruction of justice. You need to resign. He did. Now, things didn't go well in the 1974 elections for the Republicans, but ask yourself this. What would have happened to the Republican Party if they would have stuck with Nixon, if they would have gone down, if they would have gone all in for Nixon? And they would have become the party of Nixon for the next decade. Would Ronald Reagan have ever been elected president? So there are moments in a party's history where doing the right thing is what saves you. In the 1960s, William F. Buckley Jr. made a decision that the conservative movement needed to cleanse itself of the extremists, of the John Birches. You needed to get rid of the racists and the anti-Semites, the people who thought that Dwight Eisenhower was a communist agent. If he had not done that, would the conservative movement ever have become credible on the issue of anti-communism, or would it have gone down some sort of conspiratorial rabbit hole? The problem is now that we have these folks from the fever swamp back in American politics, and there are no gatekeepers. There's no way of getting rid of them. So the toxic nature, the poison, is going to stay. And I think it's going to be very, very hard to shake that.
So we'd like to open it up to questions from the floor. Yes, Matt.
You talked at the beginning, Charlie, about tribalism.
I'm sorry?
You talked about tribes in the beginning, tribalism.
Right.
What if the situation were a little reversed? In other words, what if Donald Trump or somebody like him were appointing liberal, pro-choice judges and was for Green New Deal and Medicare for all, but was doing all the other things? Would Democrats stand up against him, do you think, or would they probably be the same?
Well, it's hard. I mean, look, when during the Clinton impeachment, Democrats rallied around, even though the fact that the president had lied under oath and had sex with a 21-year-old intern in the Oval Office, which would have been unthinkable. So tribal loyalty is very, very powerful. But keep in mind that what's happening with Trump is not really about policy. The only thing that you mentioned there that I think is the glue are the judges, that Republicans are going to stick with him. Democrats seem to be a much more fractious group, and you can see this going on right now, that there's really a vigorous debate going on about things like, like for example, Medicare for all. So the problem with the Republicans right now is that it's not about ideas or policies. It really has become this cult of personality. Because there are Republicans who are all over the map in terms of policy, but as long as you are loyal to Donald Trump, you're still in the tribe. I can still be down the line conservative on all policies, but if I reject Donald Trump, I'm out. So this is the question, is whether or not a party becomes a vehicle for one individual, or whether it continues to have these messy ideological policy debates. And by the way, some of those things that you brought up, I think that if the Democrats go into the 2020 election with that platform, I think that Donald Trump will be reelected.
So to make things easier, we're gonna, and since there's a lot of interest, we're gonna form a line actually over here by Hannah. She's gonna help take your questions, and that we make sure everyone's heard. So if you have a question, please feel free to.
Nobody wants to stand up.
You want me over there? Okay. You want? Okay.
I understand that the OLC memo is extrajudicial. And it has frustrated me for years now that no one is doing anything about it. Everyone complains about it, but no one is testing it. Why is that?
That's an excellent question. I think it will be tested during the campaign. I think it will be tested with the next president. By the way, she's referring to the OLC memo is the memo that says you can't charge the president. But right now, who's going to challenge it? You know, who has standing to challenge it at the moment? One of the most disturbing things, quite frankly, is watching the way the Attorney General is in fact treating the Department of Justice. One of the disturbing things about Bill Barr being the Attorney General for Donald Trump is they both believe in the unitary executive, which seems to be that everything in the executive branch flows from the president, that he has the power to do anything he wants. And I think that that is a dangerous, dangerous precedent. But I don't know. I've read articles from very respected legal scholars who are responsible for a candidate who think that it has been misapplied and certainly could be altered. But
I have another question.
yeah, sure.
I'm going to go to the back of the line.
I hope I can express this properly. But I agree with much of what you brought forward tonight. However, I'd like to just hear your comments on Benghazi, the Hillary emails, and the Kavanaugh
That's a too much answer.
whatever his nomination, and how that process all went. I mean, your comments are very true, but it's not all on one side of the fence. It's
Oh, no,
where
man.
I'm going with this, and I'd just like to hear your comments on these other things that come about.
Well, all right. So let me start with Hillary's emails, which she mishandled greatly. However, it did occur to me today. The story that came out of the impeachment hearing was that Ambassador Sondland is in a cafe somewhere in Kiev or Kiev, however you want to pronounce it, and he gets a phone call on his cell phone from the President of the United States, who's calling him on his cell phone and having a conversation. Which means, as everybody apparently knows in diplomatic circles, is that Vladimir Putin is listening in on that because any unsecured communication is going to be listened to. Okay, I'm bringing this up in the context of Hillary's emails because what was that about? Hillary's emails were unsecure, right? And we were so concerned about the possible breach of security in her emails that we had to lock her up.
Is one worse than the other? I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Is
Well-
one that much different than the other?
Well, what I'm saying is it's ironic that this is that the president himself is engaging in this kind of conduct if in fact we were supposed to take that seriously. Okay, so Benghazi, when I was on the radio, I talked about that a lot because I really did think, because I remember I was there on the air the day that it happened, and I remember the way that it was spun over the weekend. And I do think that there was something there. I don't know whether all of the conspiracy theories were true, but I did think it was legitimate to hold Hillary Clinton and others accountable for that. I'm not sure she was the only one who needed to be held accountable for that. But I do, you remember that moment when Senator Ron Johnson was questioning her, and she said, she kind of blew up and she said, well, I don't care whether these guys were out for a walk or what they were doing. And I remember saying at the time, this may cost her the presidency because it was an inappropriate moment. So that was legit. That was, I think, a legitimate issue. Did the Republicans carry it too far? Maybe, I'm not sure. I really don't know in retrospect. And the third one, the Kavanaugh hearing, I have to say this is one of those areas where there's a factual situation, it's a factual reality that I don't know what it was. And yet, unfortunately, this is where the tribal loyalties demand that you believe one side or another. I do think that there are legitimate reasons. I mean, when I heard Christine Blasey Ford's testimony, I thought she was credible. On the other hand, there were allegations that were absolutely reckless, that were absolutely irresponsible. And there was an attempt to smear Judge Kavanaugh. Did he get a fair shake? Did we get a full investigation of that? I don't know at this point. But I think there was something deeply wrong in the process in which, now help me with the name of the sleazy lawyer who went down, what was his name?
Michael Avenatti.
Michael Avenatti, thank you. When Michael Avenatti popped up at the last moment and he had the woman who claimed that there was, this serial gang rape or something, Democrats should have had more self-discipline and integrity than to have allowed him to intervene in the process at that point, and that did cast some doubt about it. But this is part of the ugliness of our process, is that anything goes, and that when one side traffics in exaggerations or lies, that becomes the license for the other side to do the same thing. And that's where the spiral of whataboutism is taking us. And so in almost every debate that I have, it's like somebody will say, well, yes, he's lying about this, or yes, you're smearing an innocent man, but what about this? They did it. And the response should be, well, that was wrong. You knew it was wrong when they did it. Why do you think it's okay when your side does it?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you. I just want to put a plug in for your newsletter that I'm a lifelong Democrat and pretty liberal, but if anyone has an interest in just going on and on with reading, your Bulwark is it keeps me busy for hours of reading. But my question is, I was listening to NPR this morning and Representative Grossman was on, and I was just like, who is this guy? And then I realized, oh, this is him. And I'm just wondering, because he was just like falling in line with, liking, just following Trump. And I'm just like, what can I do, or what can we do to pressure, if we feel like we need to pressure our representatives in Congress or at the state level or national level? What can we do as citizens to find a change in what's happening?
Well, I've spent the last 3 years trying to pressure, cajole, shame Republicans into look, you don't need to fall in line. You don't need, if you want to vote for conservative policies, vote for conservative policies. You don't need to defend the personal conduct. Guys like Glenn, who I have known for many years, Glenn is very interested in policy. He is a policy guy. He's one of the people who I think would say, all right, I'm going along with this in order to get certain legislation that I want. And yet, what do they find themselves doing today? They're not talking about Trump's policies, they're talking about his personal conduct. And I don't think that's fully necessary unless, of course, it's this all or nothing tribal politics. It's all about power. Yes, he's done this, he's lied, he's corrupt, etc. But we need to stick with him because otherwise we lose power. That, I think, is a short-sighted approach. And that's the thing is, I don't know how to appeal to somebody. Look, Republicans, including, and by the way, I'm not trying to beat up on Glenn individually here, but right now, because of the way our political system is designed, Republicans really don't worry about voters like you. They don't worry about people on the other side or independents. What they most worry about is whether they're going to be challenged in a Republican primary. So it's only Republicans who stand up and say, wait, we didn't sign up for this. Right. And unfortunately, that's not happening. But thank you for the plug for the vote.
That's good.
I'm not a liberal Democrat, but I also do the Bulwark. The Bulwark Podcast.
Thank you.
Enough of the sucking up.
My question, really, don't feel you need to credit for it.
You mentioned Nixon resigning in 1974. In 1974 as well, Congress passed the Impeachment Act, which said the president cannot withhold money that's been appropriated by Congress. Now, currently, we're talking about a president who allegedly withheld $393 million in security and military aid for Ukraine, and then released it for whatever reason. But at what point does withholding funds that Congress has appropriated for a specific purpose become impoundment?
Well, that clearly would have been impoundment, and I think just as I was coming in here, apparently one of the officials of the OMB who was involved in that process has now agreed he's going to testify about this. So this is going to be a key issue in the hearings going forward. I mean, just since you mentioned this, because the president does not have the ability to simply say that he's not going to release the money that's been appropriated by Congress until you launch a fake investigation of one of my political foes. So this is unraveling in that particular way. And as I said before, I mean, the extraordinary thing about this particular story is we already know all the details. We know what, I mean, look, we know what Rudy Giuliani was doing. We know what the president was doing. We know what the quid pro quo was. I think it's kind of interesting watching people in Washington argue that we shouldn't use the Latin phrase because Americans don't know Latin, so we have to come up with different words. I think people understand this. The question is whether they care about it. I can explain it, but I can't make you care about it.
Thank you.
Okay, this is going to sound, excuse me, fairly egotistical, but I hate what the Republicans are doing in the hearings with their ad hominem arguments. I'm a scientist, I believe in objective facts, and I wish that people would stick to them. But I think that I saw yesterday a huge miss by the majority in terms of rebutting a claim of the minority side. And they just let it slide by, and I'm going, wait, say something, say something. Who can I contact to maybe pass this along? I can't contact my representative. I don't think he'll give it to the majority.
Well, you do have a Democratic U.S. Senator from Wisconsin who might be able to do that.
True, but she's not on the
Right, that's right.
So, do you have any suggestions?
Well, you can always write an email to them. You can write a letter to the editor.
Of whom?
Well, whatever publication you want. So what was the big mess? Can you explain?
Well, the Republicans argued that Donald Trump's been giving aid to Ukraine all along, every year before this year, so he couldn't possibly have anything against Ukraine. And they argue at the same time that he was very concerned about corruption with this brand new president who's supposedly anti-corruption, and that he held up the money to check him out.
Right.
Well, the fallacy in that argument is that he didn't care about stopping the money when the Ukrainian government was known corrupt. Why would he now suddenly care when a new anti-corruption government is there?
Okay, well, to cut them a little bit of slack, this was just day one. This was just the first day. And the point you're making is completely legitimate because the timeline just doesn't make any sense. Part of the problem is that what the Republicans are doing right now is they're just throwing up, they're spaghetti, they're throwing spaghetti on the wall to see what sticks. And many of their defenses are simply mutually exclusive. There are some of them who argue, well, there was no quid pro quo. Others will say, well, of course there was a quid pro quo, but it was completely justifiable. He was just doing his job. Then there are others who will say, well, yes, it was inappropriate, but it's not impeachable. Well, they have to make up their mind at some point. And the fact is that, what other country has Donald Trump been concerned about corruption? When did Donald Trump become a big anti-corruption integrity fucker? Would Donald Trump have been interested in what's going on in Ukraine if Joe Biden was not a leading Democratic candidate for president? And also, keep in mind, and this is a name that I'm a little frustrated so far we haven't heard more of. Remember, this is a guy whose chairman of his presidential campaign was Paul Manafort, who is now in federal prison, in part because he was pocketing so much corrupt Ukrainian money. So, but let it play out. It's only day one.
Thank you.
So we're running short on time, so we're just going to take these last two questions.
I just had a question. I'll try to wrap this up. No, I don't want that.
about Ron Johnson.
Yes.
And he certainly put his name out there in the past few weeks with the interviews that he's done. And then he says on camera about how Donald Trump told him, he was adamant that he did not do any quid pro quo with Ukraine. And I just had this deja vu moment of Trump sitting with Putin and Trump saying, he said he didn't interfere with our elections. I mean, he does not believe in our national security, but he's believing Putin. So my question to you is, if it comes down to a vote in the Senate, do you think Ron Johnson should recuse himself?
Oh, if Johnson recused himself, then so should half the Republican caucus. I mean, this is one where the jury is already lining up. Lindsey Graham should recuse himself. I can make a long list of people who ought to recuse themselves. This is one of the flaws in the impeachment process, is that the jurors, who are supposed to be finders of fact, in fact are political actors and have made it clear that they're not in fact open-minded and will not be listening to the evidence. And I have to say that Johnson's position on this his position on Trump in general has been very disappointing, because I think when he came into office, he was prepared to be an independent senator, really sort of in the Wisconsin mode of Bill Proxmire, and yet has decided to go down some of these rabbit holes. And I'm really sorry that he's chosen to do that, because I had very high hopes for him.
Thank you.
Charlie, I'd like to applaud you for your willingness to be honest and your candor, and thank you for, I think you bring credibility to your positions because you've been on the opposite side and you're now willing to look at issues in a more broad way, I believe.
Keep waiting for the buck.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. I have a two-part question. And one is your opinion on gerrymandering, and then the other is your opinion on the Electoral College.
Oh, hey, look. Now, I'm in flux on the Electoral College. Let me get to that in a moment. I think that gerrymandering, first of all, I hope the Democrats do not continue to use it as an excuse for losing elections. I just think that there's too many, there are too many folks that simply think that the only reason the Democrats lose elections is because of gerrymandering, because of money, not because of the messaging. I just think that's self-defeating. I think they need to engage in some introspection. But gerrymandering is one of the things that has sorted us out. That we have, several things are happening in our country. We are geographically sorting ourselves out by demographics and by politics. Red is getting redder, blue is getting bluer. We are really physically now more and more living in different countries. At the same time, this is happening on social media, which you all know. We've sorted ourselves out into our different universes. But the gerrymandering has really created this environment, like I was describing with Congressman Grothman, but it's true of everybody, that it reduces the incentive to talk to Americans across the divide. There's no need to. You look at that Republican caucus, and quite frankly, only a handful of them are at any risk of losing their seats to a Democrat. They don't have to be concerned about that. Their main fear is just other Republicans. It's true on the Democratic side as well. So that has really contributed to the gridlock and to the division. The Electoral College, I've always been a supporter. I've never written about this. I've never spoken about this, because I think